Growing up, my best friend was Robert Moretti, a fast-talking Italian boy who was bigger and tougher than most kids our age. I'd known him since we were preschoolers. Just beyond Robert's house was a dead-end street. One of the houses on it was the Hanson house, a supposed haunted house, which inspired countless urban legends and ghoulish tales. The only people reportedly living there back then was the mother and son. The mother, they said, was a witch. The boy, Tommy Hanson, was close to our age, but nobody I knew played with him or anything. In fact, he was rarely seen leaving the house. He must have been homeschooled or something. One particular Halloween, Robert devised a brilliant plan of trick-or-treating at the haunted house, so he did, and I damn near got scared to death. This was 1990. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was the thing, so Robert and I dressed up as Michelangelo and Leonardo respectively. Oh, to be 12 again. With our bags stuffed with candy, we slowly worked our way towards the old Hanson house. When we came to the place, we stopped in front of it and regarded it for a moment. The house was big and ugly and made of stone, plus it smelled of worms. The moon was full. The air was cool and crisp. A smattering of trick-or-treaters were huddled outside the Hansons' front door, but not many, and they didn't stay long. "Hurry up, Paul," Robert said nervously. He nudged me forward. I went. I walked tepidly along the pathway running beside the driveway, which led to the front door. A scarecrow was sitting lifelessly on a wooden bench next to the door, looking solemnly towards the street. It looked kinda scary. It wore overalls stuffed with hay and a scarf as old as dirt. On its head was a spine-chilling jack-o'-lantern with sharp slanted eyes and a toothy grin that made me cringe. It looked like it wanted to bite me. Something about it didn't seem right. I could feel its empty eyes penetrating me as I got nearer. By this time, it was just me and Robert. All the other trick-or-treaters had disappeared. Robert nudged me forward. Grudgingly, I lumbered on, ignoring the hideous Halloween prop sitting on the bench, until I reached the front door of the Hanson house. I was nervous, but I didn't let it show. With Robert by my side edging me on, I pushed the glowing red doorbell. Suddenly, as I was preparing to come face to face with the Hanson witch, as she was often referred to, the scarecrow lunged at me, arms extended, and grabbed my neck. I screamed, dropped my bag of candy, and split. Robert followed. The two of us didn't hesitate. We booked it down the walkway away from the Hanson house and never looked back. Robert teased me for a month and how scared I was. He later told me that the Scarecrow Man was an actual prank the Hansons liked to play on the public. The Scarecrow was actually the boy Tommy. "What a great costume," he said. I agreed, but I wanted revenge. That's why the following year, when Robert suggested we find a video camera to record some other kids getting scared to death, then send the tape to America's Funniest Home Videos with Bob Saget, I agreed. I borrowed my father's camera. Back then, those cameras were highly regarded and quite expensive, so when I borrowed it, I used that term loosely. The sky was ominous and dull. The streetlights mingled with the pale moonlight, creating the perfect backdrop for our childish prank. Robert was dressed up as the Terminator. I was Axl Rose. I remember. We crept even closer to the Hanson house. A handful of parents could be seen loitering on the sidewalk, but not many. When we arrived at the Hanson house, we watched as a group of kids in silly costumes approached the front door. A girl, dressed up as a Catwoman, pressed the doorbell. When the door opened, she shouted "Trick or treat." I could see the sneer in Miss Hanson's face as she gave away her toothsome treats. It gave me chills. She really was a witch. Her costume was elaborate, flawless. Her skin was sickly green and covered in warts. Her long, pointed nose was as sharp as a blade. Her teetering black hat sparkled under the glow of the waning porch light. I didn't want to get any closer to her. Nope, not one bit. Robert pulled me aside. "Give me your camera," he demanded. I obliged. He powered it up. "There he is." He pointed to the scarecrow on the bench. "That must be Tommy. Look at him in his ridiculous costume." Robert was doing his best to sound brave, but I knew better. Sitting limply on the brown bench next to the front door was the scarecrow with its carved pumpkin head, just like the previous year. Only this year it seemed uglier. Its crudely carved eyes seemed to regard me with mild amusement, his dagger-like teeth daring me to come closer. I knew Tommy must be inside the costume, but I wouldn't know it from looking at that thing. Robert pointed the camera and told me to get going. Slowly, as if inspecting every maple leaf that was crackling at my feet, I left the safety of the sidewalk and edged towards the Hanson house. "Hurry up, fool," Robert insisted. He shoved me again, harder this time. I tried to move, but my feet were not cooperating. In truth, I was spooked, both of the scarecrow and of the witch waiting at the front door. Finally, I took a deep breath, held it, and then found my courage. What was I afraid of? I remember thinking, I'm 13 years old. I'm too old to be spooked. As I got going, my eyes never left the scarecrow sitting inertly on the bench. Any minute now, Tommy will leap out from the bench and terrify the unsuspecting little girl. Instead, after Catwoman and her friends collected their candy, they said thank you, then scurried off. The scarecrow did not budge. Another group of trick-or-treaters appeared. We let them go ahead of us. This was our chance. Robert, who was close behind me, said, "Act natural." I was shaking. Again, the scarecrow was unresponsive to the fresh batch of trick-or-treaters. They simply came and went. Something inside me was stirring anger. 364 days of pent-up teenage angst was about to burst. I became unhinged. With unwarranted bravery, I charged at the scarecrow on the bench. Robert shouted, "Wait," but it was too late. Unfortunately, I tripped on my shoelace, a lifelong habit, and fell flat on my face, directly in front of the scarecrow. Its soiled black boots were too big for any boy my age, I realized unhappily. Still, on my knees I looked up, directly into the scarecrow's pumpkin-carved face. A candle flame flickered from inside the jack-o'-lantern. Robert, who was still holding the camera, shouted, "Trick or treat, you stupid pumpkin brain," and started laughing and jumping up and down. Miss Hanson the witch came out from the front door and spat at him. The cackling of her voice sent chills down my spine. I turned my attention to her for a moment. When I looked back at the scarecrow, I could see Tommy's gray eyes lurking inside the jack-o'-lantern. Although he wasn't there a moment ago, it winked, then it lumbered towards me. I screamed. By now, the other trick-or-treaters were laughing and pointing and jokingly asking Tommy Hanson to show them the inside of his jack-o'-lantern. Tommy refused. Instead, he simply sat back down on the bench and went still, waiting for his next unsuspecting victim. I was furious. Robert dragged me away from the front door. We didn't bother asking for candy. I think he was spooked by Tommy's mother, the witch, although he'd never admit to this. We teased each other for the next half hour. Then I went home and cleaned up my poop-stained underpants for the second year in a row. The next day at school, we shared a heartfelt laugh. Robert, who initially refused to return my father's camera, eventually gave it back after we'd watched the footage over and over again at his place. The funniest part, of course, was my reaction. One moment the scarecrow was sitting laggedly on the bench, the next moment it was attacking me. We soon forgot about this incident, seeing how there was other cool stuff happening at school that stole our interest. And needless to say, I never bothered sending the tape to America's Funniest Home Videos. Eventually, the video camera, along with the tape, ended up in a taped-up cardboard box waiting in my father's garage for 30 years. When he passed away this summer, my son Brandon discovered it. Brandon, who is now the same age as I was on that tape, was intrigued by this relic from the past. Brandon took the tape, digitized it, and then played it for me recently. It was a blast from the past, I tell you. I thought it was hysterical. Brandon, on the other hand, was alarmed. "Watch what happens when you zoom in," he said in a shaky voice. When he zoomed in, I shuddered. "This must be a mistake," I told him. He assured me it was not. He backtracked and I watched the scene again, this time with a careful eye. There I was, at 13, dressed as my favorite rock star, standing 6 feet in front of the scarecrow on the bench. "Now, watch this," Brandon said. I watched. My stomach was in knots. I watched as a young boy on the screen, who looked eerily like Brandon, only smaller, came alive. The camera is pointed at my back. I make a beeline for the bench, falling flat on my face. The camera shakes as Robert is shouting something, but only for a moment. Then he zooms in on the scarecrow. Without warning, the scarecrow springs out of his sitting position with his arms stretched out, just as I'm returning to my feet, and attacks me. I scream and trip and fall down again. I'd forgotten that part. That must have been when I crapped my pants. Soon, We were ambushed by a bunch of bratty boys who swarmed the scarecrow, and then the video cuts off. Brandon tweaked the settings on his screen and rewound the video. Now check this out. He pressed play. Only now it played in slow motion, zoomed in entirely on the scarecrow. Just as I suspected, I said under my breath. Well, I'll be. Dad, Brandon said, what the hell is that thing? I could now see the inside of the jack-o'-lantern, and yes, there was a small flame flickering inside of it. Except it wasn't an actual flame, probably a cheap dollar store replica. Now, here's where it gets extra creepy, he said. Watch carefully. He pointed to the screen. I watched. For a moment the scarecrow seems unaffected, lifeless. Then suddenly, a face appears inside the pumpkin head. What the? I muttered. Right? Play it again. He did. I gasped. This is impossible, Brandon said. He was intrigued, although the fear in his eyes was beyond doubt. But there was something else in his eyes, the inevitable curiosity of a 13-year-old boy. It wasn't long before he'd convinced me to bring him and his best friend Bruno Moretti to that spooky old house for Halloween. Apparently Bruno knew all about the Hansen house. I drove by the Hansen house this morning to scope it out. I hadn't been to that part of town in many years. What amazed me as I drove past the place was how unaffected by time the house seemed. To be fair, the place is over 150 years old, so what's another 30 years, right? Still, I didn't like it, nor did I like the scarecrow sitting corpse-like on the bench out on the veranda. I pulled the car out and got out. I'm not crazy, I told myself as I trotted towards the scarecrow, smartphone in hand. I pointed my phone at the scarecrow and pressed record just in case. I stood for a moment, 6 feet in front of it, unsure of what to do. I waved goodbye jokingly, and then I got back inside my car and tore out of there. My heart was beating faster than I cared to admit. I didn't tell Brandon about my venture, but I wish I had, because there's no way in hell that I'm taking him to the Hansen house tonight. I won't do it, no matter how much of a fuss he makes. I just watched the video and saw something disturbing, something I didn't notice at the time. When I zoomed in, even an old fart like me can do that on an Android. I saw the witch standing outside the front door, leering at me, although I swear she wasn't there at the time. That's not all. The scarecrow was sitting listlessly on the brown bench by the front door suddenly sat upright. I saw the flickering light of the candle flame, from deep inside the jack-o'-lantern, switch to the boy's eye. It winked at me, then it lunged at me. I'd forgotten that part. I was never a social individual. Been that way since I was a kid. I was bullied often at school, and that caused me to be a complete introvert. Nowadays, I never really go outside, except for groceries. But that didn't stop some friends from asking me to go to some costume party with them on Halloween. They wanted to help with my social anxiety. At first I wasn't willing, but I eventually caved. What's the worst that could happen? As the days grew closer, I just decided to go to the nearest Spirit Halloween and buy some spooky jack-o'-lantern mask and a generic Dracula costume. I thought it'd be a fun combo. Halloween night fell, and just like that, we went on to the party. Having a mask helped suppress much of the anxiety I would have had otherwise. The night went on. We just hung out in our own little corner, occasionally talking to anyone who approached. Some people made jokes about my costume. I laughed along, though I honestly did think it looked cool. Flamboyant, but cool, just how I liked my monsters. Most people were either dressed as zombies, vampires, cowboys, and whatever people seem to dress up as now. Intact, I think I may have seen some people in those sexy costumes. Never been my thing. Everything just seemed kinda off, bland for lack of a better word, except for one man. I'd occasionally see him in the corner of my eyes, or just somewhere farther away from most guests. Much like me, he seemed to have grabbed a bunch of different costumes and Frankensteined them together. He wore a dirty striped straitjacket with an even more ripped and torn black hooded cloak over that. He had long black stringy hair that went down to his shoulders and his face. His face was the most impressive part of all. He had this sickly pale gray skin, bloodshotted whited out eyes. He had no nose or lips and had deep cuts all over his face, somewhere close to his mouth, giving him an unnaturally long, permanent smile. It did its job, unsettling me, that's for sure. The man didn't seem to interact with anyone for most of the party. until I guess he found a person he was looking for. A man dressed as a 90s jock was talking to who I assumed were some friends, but was interrupted when the cloaked figure walked over to him, tapped his shoulder, and when the 90s jock turned around, he tilted his head and out of nowhere, he stabbed him in the stomach repeatedly. The jock screamed as he tried to fight the gruesome man off of him. People tried to get him off, but he just started stabbing anyone who dared to interrupt him. The party was filled with screams. Everyone was running around frantically. Many called the police. Luckily, my friends and I got out there unharmed. Eventually, police got a hold of him, and he was quickly arrested. They couldn't seem to ID him, though news sources were quick to name him the Halloween Butcher. When questioned, he would only say that the man bullied him when they were in high school, and thus somehow justified what he did. No one has heard about what happened to him since. We don't even know if he was actually locked up or not. Some say he managed to escape. Others say he was just simply shot. Well, wherever he is, I just hope he rots. Jesus, I still can't get that face out of my head. I still see it in the corners of my vision every so often. At night, I'll even see him in the dark corners of my house, always staring at me, his eyes never blinking. It was Halloween, and I was sitting at the couch watching my favorite cartoon. I had a bowl of cereal, and I had the heat turned up. My parents were out, so it felt perfect. I liked being to myself. People saw me as antisocial, but it was just my personality. I had a strong aversion to being around people for too long. My parents told me to make sure I answered the door though, since they weren't going to be leaving a bowl of candy outside. Last year it got stolen within the first hour. Typical. I saw the sun starting to set outside. I knew people would be running up to the door any time now. I had to run to the store and grab some candy. My parents had rushed out and had forgotten to grab candy the night before. I grabbed the keys while groaning, slipped on the jacket, and turned the knob to the door. The store wasn't far. It was about a 10-minute walk from my house. Walking there, I had my headphones on and my head down, so I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary until I approached the store. I walked up to the store. The lights were on, but no one seemed to be inside. I was baffled. I couldn't understand why the store owner would leave the store empty. I called out to see if anyone was perhaps just in the back, but I received no answer. It was too quiet. I wandered around the store for about 5 minutes before concluding that it was truly empty. I walked out stunned at the fact that the store owner would abandon his store like that, on the whim. I walked back home, this time with my headphones off. The whole neighborhood, in fact, seemed to be empty and had no one on the streets. On Halloween of all nights, there was not a person in sight. This had to be some kind of joke, except I wasn't in on it. I started jogging around the neighborhood, searching familiar spots that I visited. First, I stopped at the park. I used to frequently see people here anytime I would be hanging out. Usually people were. No one was there. Next, I jogged to the cemetery. An odd choice, but trust me, in my neighborhood people were odd. It was empty as usual. I crept around making sure to explore any crevices I might have missed. I didn't know where else to go at this point. I hardly left the house, but from the looks of it, no one was in the neighborhood. I saw some of the neighbors' doors left wide open with the lights still on. That was a huge red flag. I went up to the Jeffersons who lived right across from us. Their door was slightly ajar. I knocked on it, yelling, "Mr. and Mrs. Jefferson, are you home?" No answer. This was strange. They had decorations outside. Usually they were one of the most involved people I saw on Halloween night, handing out candy while outside and greeting people while sitting on their porch. This was truly out of the ordinary. I decided to walk inside. Since no one else was around, I had nothing to lose. Upon walking in, I saw a startling sight. Everything, and I mean everything in the house was gone. It was empty, from top to bottom, as if nothing had ever existed there. Not like someone came and took everything out, but as if nothing was ever there in the first place. I walked around the empty house, swiveling my head around with my jaw wide open. The house seemed 10 times bigger now, that nothing was in there. After a while, I finally left. It's been about halfway into the night at this point. I see no sign of life still. The strangest thing is that the more I explore, the more things seem to be out of the ordinary. Things seem like they are slowly disappearing, from furniture and houses to people not being here, to traffic lights not being in the roads anymore. The anomalies are getting bigger and harder to not notice. Of course, it hardly matters, since I'm the only person here anyway. I'm not sure if this is a bad dream, or if I'm stuck in a bad hallucination, or what I did to deserve this, but please, I beg of you, whoever is out there, a higher power, God, the universe, whatever, help me. Seems like the tests are running perfectly. He believes he's in a dystopian world that has no one left in it. We'll have to keep running those tests to see how he'll respond though. It's far too dangerous for him to ever wake up. Humanity would be doomed. Better to keep him docile in a state of well. This? Dr. Roswell looked up from the screen at Dr. Starlight. She gave him a reassuring look. Don't worry, Dr. Roswell. We won't have a repeat of what happened back then. It would be disastrous. Luckily, we were able to subdue him and get him there safely. The world is a much better place for it. If he thinks people do still exist, then that might be problematic. We had to change his belief system. Dr. Roswell looked back at the screen. He knew this was slightly immortal, but if he was ever to wake up, humanity would face a threat far worse than any war. He sighed, shut off the lights and packed up his things. He got ready to head home to his family. They were waiting for him.